Welcome back to Focus Today. Steve Johnson here with you, and my special guest is Darío Fernández-Morera. He is an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Northwestern University. He's also gotten a PhD from Harvard, written quite a few books, and in fact we're going to be talking about one that I think is very topical for this time of year. It's called The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise, Muslims, Christians, and Jews under Islamic Rule in Medieval Spain. Hey, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Let me ask you, what was your reason for delving into this particular topic?
Well, it all started when I was researching some passages in Cervantes' Don Quixote in which he deals with Islam. And so I began to research the matter, and then I realized that everything I thought I knew about Islamic Spain was wrong.
Now, this is interesting. It was quite a few years ago. I was in Spain, and it was fascinating to see the cultural influence from Islam coming up from the south, as well as the European. It was kind of like a compilation of cultures that had taken over various times in the Spanish history to have a major influence in it. And certainly the Islamic influence, I don't know if people really generally understand that, was a huge influence during certain parts of Spain, areas of Spain at different times. We think of Islam as being, we've been told it is a religion of peace, and so that has to have a historical context. What was it that you found? Is that true?
Well, I have to talk basically about what I have researched, which is the medieval Spain, which the time period would be between 711 and about the end of the 15th century. And the reality of the situation is that Spain was conquered by the Islamic Caliphate through force. And through force, they made the inhabitants either submit and agree to pacts of submission or flee to the north. The north of Spain, the northwest, was never conquered. And it's from that northwest that the movement to recover the land for Christianity, the so-called Reconquista, began. And eventually it did defeat the Muslim invaders and reconquered the land for Christianity. When Islam conquered Spain, it was a Christian land.
Was this kind of a back and forth battle between Christianity and Islam during that period that you were talking about?
Yes, it was a back and forth state of war. Sometimes there was peace. Sometimes there were alliances between Muslim forces and Christian forces against other Muslim forces or other Christian forces, which is not unusual in conquests. If you look, for example, at the Spanish conquest of the Americas, you can see that the Spanish conquerors ally themselves frequently with certain Indian nations against other dominant Indian nations. That happened, for example, in Mexico, where the Mexica, or the so-called Aztecs, had a big empire, and they controlled many other Indian nations. Well, those Indian nations saw their opportunity when the Spaniards arrived, and they allied themselves with the Spaniards to defeat what they considered their oppressors, the Mexica or Aztecs. And there were also great, phenomenal interaction between the Indian cultures and the Spanish cultures. And in Latin America today, you can see the effects of that cultural interaction. Look, cultural interaction, if you look for it, exists in many situations in which there have been conquered and they have been conquerors. Even in the Spanish South, you can see how the presence of slavery impacted the culture of the South. The thing is that we are within it and we don't notice it. We go to Spain and we notice, oh wow, look at the presence of Islam. But if you look at the United States, you will also see the presence of other cultures impacting ours, including cultures that have been made slaves. I mean, slaves were imported here, and yet they eventually had an impact, a cultural impact on the culture of our country. I don't have to enumerate the facts. So this happens in many other areas. We only notice it in Spain because it's not our country. Anyway.
Some of the effects that you saw, getting back to kind of the topic of your book about medieval Spain, what was the impact of Islam in that region during that period?
Well, the impact that one notices frequently is in the language. For example, about 6%, between 5 and 6% of the Spanish vocabulary is of Arabic origin. However, that is very little compared, for example, to the impact of the French conquest of England. You have about 30% of the words that we are using in English come from French. And that is the result of the Norman conquest of England in 1066. The Normans, of course, were culturally French and linguistically dominated England for quite a long time. So that impacted England, but the impact was much greater than in Spain. About 30%, I repeat, of the vocabulary in English comes from French. In Spanish, it was much less, about 6%, between 5 and 6% of the vocabulary comes from Arabic. There are some elements of architecture that can be detected in southern Spain, but even the architecture itself, curiously enough, much of that architecture is actually based on pre-Islamic architecture. For example, the horseshoe arch, which is so characteristic of presumably Islamic architecture, is not Islamic. It was something that existed there in Spain before Islam arrived. It was characteristic of Visigoth architecture, and in fact, it was derived from the arches in the Christian Roman Empire. So even before that, that type of arch existed in Christian lands. But of course, people don't know that. You have to ask a specialist about these things.
Yeah. Elaborate a little bit about the social impact of Islam. Was that, I mean, you think of a conquering people as perhaps being not necessarily the friendliest towards the locals, so to speak. What was the impact when Islam would move into an area like Spain?
Well, it would depend on how the inhabitants reacted. If they submitted without a fight, then they were given the chance to live in a state of submission as dhimis. That is the word used by Islamic legislators and Islamic authorities to refer to the Christians and Jews under Islamic domination who had submitted to Islam. And in exchange for not being killed, they paid a tax called the jizya, which is normally called protection, but it's very gangster-like. It's like a gangster today goes to a business and says, well, okay, I'm going to protect you, but you have to pay us. So it was a system of extortion in order to allow you to keep your religion within your own neighborhoods and within your churches. There were all sorts of limitations also. For example, no Christian building could be taller or of the same height as a Muslim mosque. They have to be visually inferior, and no Christian signs could be visible from the outside on the Christian buildings. And of course, no public processions could take place, no ringing of bells. So you were allowed to practice your religion under very discreet conditions. So that was an option. If the population resisted, then the results could be very dire. The population the males, the fighters, once they were defeated, they would be killed or enslaved. The women, as a matter of course, would be turned into slaves, the young ones into sexual slaves, the others into all sorts of different slavery, and also the children would be turned into slaves. A city that resisted could be burned down. So the methods were quite drastic, but actually very effective, because the other population would be terrorized, and they would think, better to submit than fight, and if we lose, we will be simply exterminated or enslaved. So those were the two choices that were given to the population of Spain, and many submitted and agreed to engage in this sort of pact with the invaders, especially many of the nobles and the higher church authorities and so forth.
Yeah.
Others fled to the north. So that's what happened.
So it was almost like submit or you'll feel the consequences. It's not exactly falling in line with that peaceable concept we have of Islam, of coexistence. It doesn't sound like that was allowed at all.
Well, there was coexistence, but under conditions.
Under the rules, yeah.
I mean, if you compare that coexistence, for example, with the situation of, say, blacks in the South before the civil rights movement, I mean, blacks are infinitely much better than Christians or Jews had it in Spain, and yet we think that situation was intolerable. Whereas when we think of that, we are told, well, it was nice. They could coexist there, blah, blah, blah. Nonsense.
That wasn't the case. I'll tell you what, we're talking with Darío Fernández-Morera. He's got a PhD from Harvard. He's also an associate professor at the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Northwestern University. He's written the book, and it is called The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise, Muslims, Christians, and Jews Under the Islamic Rule in Medieval Spain. We're going to continue our discussion with him in just a couple minutes. Keep it tuned right here on Focus Today.
I'm Paulina Leiser, producer of Focus Today. Thank you for watching this video, and make sure to check our other videos at theDove.us.
Well, welcome back to Focus Today. Our guest today is Darío Fernández-Morera. I should say Dr. Fernández-Morera, Associate Professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Northwestern University, and he's also got a PhD from Harvard, publishing several books, including one that we are talking about today called The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise, Muslims, Christians, and Jews Under Islamic Rule in Medieval Spain. You talked a little bit about, and we've seen this in history, of course, before, when a conquering nation comes in, there are times where the people they have conquered have to submit or they pay the consequences. And this is also in the backdrop of what we've heard as Islam being a peaceful religion, and you've kind of pointed out, at least during the medieval ages, that there were some dire consequences to some of those who would certainly oppose them. Are there tactics you're seeing now that are being used as we look at ISIS and some of the other hot spots of the world as this form of Islam is moving through, that you see reflected in what may have happened in your studies in medieval Spain?
Yes, the analogies are very noticeable. For example, in the methods of conquest, the use of terror, what I call shock and awe tactics. If a population resists, they are exterminated and enslaved. And of course, those who are neither Christians nor Jews are not given the choice of submission. They simply convert or are killed, which was also the case in medieval Islam. The option that I mentioned earlier of becoming dhimmis and pay the jizya was given only in the case of Spain to Christians and Jews. In other parts of the world, in North Africa, for example, the Berber tribes who were pagan, the option they were given was to convert to Islam or die. And the Berbers resisted, but they were defeated. And most of them converted to Islam and became part of the Muslim armies that actually went on to invade Spain. The majority of the invaders initially were Berbers from North Africa, led by Arab commanders and some Arab troops. So yes, the methods of conquest of Islamic State, of the Islamic Caliphate of al-Baghdadi today, are very much the same methods used by the Islamic Caliphate of the Arabs in medieval times, and later by the Islamic Caliphate of the Turks. And they're very effective methods because they use terror.
Well, yes, for sure. You know, we hear a lot about Sharia law, and some people have a hard time believing that actually it exists now. Did you find a form of Sharia law also being used in medieval times as well as what we see today?
Well, Sharia law was fundamental to medieval Islam. You cannot differentiate between the law and the religion in Islam. The two are the same. In Western civilization, we distinguish between civil law and religious law. For example, the Catholic Church has something called canon law, which is how it rules itself, and it's different. That's not applied to the civilian population. In the West, we have a civil law. That distinction doesn't exist in medieval Islam. So when we talk about whether or not Sharia law was applied, well, it would depend on how conscientious a judge would be. But the civilization itself is based on Islamic law. There's no distinction between, say, politics and religion. Politics is religious-based. So these distinctions we make in the West between politics and religion make no sense in medieval Islam. Islam was permeated every aspect of an individual's life, and therefore Sharia permeated every aspect of an individual's life, from your relation to your children, to your wife, to your neighbors, to the authorities. Everything was based on religious law. Which, by the way, is not so much a Sharia, which is a general concept of law based on God's teachings, but its application itself was called fiqh. So the experts in law were the fuqaha or faqih. A faqih was an expert in the actual application of Sharia, which is fiqh. That's how law was called then. So it was undistinguishable, the way of life from religion.
In our mindset, then, since we do make the distinction in the Western world, do you think this is why it's hard for people in the West to see Sharia law as being more integrated with religious law, where we do make that distinction of the two? Is this why it's hard for some people to admit that there is a violent element to Islam?
Well, we're talking about two different things here. The Westerners find it very difficult to realize that we cannot talk, well, it's Sharia and religious law. None of the two are the same. Sharia is religious law, and religious law is indistinguishable from law, period. The law in medieval Islamic civilization was religious, because everything was religious. It was a way of life. It's difficult to understand that. I mean, we go to church today, a Christian goes to church and then he goes about his own business, but not in the case of medieval Islam. It permeated everything, and that's what the Islamic Caliphate is doing in Iraq and Syria.
Yeah. When then news reports coming out of the West, and there seems to be a void in taking consideration with what you've just mentioned. What do you think should be done more in the West to understand that situation more clearly? Do we need to be much more direct in what Islamic law is about? Do you see it somewhat sugar-coated in the media, for example, when you watch the news?
Completely. Partly out of ignorance, partly out of trying to promote certain do-goody agendas, but the ignorance should be combated. And the religious texts of medieval Islam are available in English, many of them, in English, Spanish, and French, and German. Some of them are not available in English. Some of them are available in French. So that has posed an obstacle to the understanding of it, but there is also an intentional effort to gloss over the actual facts of medieval Islamic law and how that actually correlates with the way the Islamic Caliphate in Iraq and Syria is acting. Those people there are very knowledgeable about medieval Islamic law. I mean, some experts on Islam say no, they don't know what they're talking about. I think that they do, and their methods, again, reflect the methods of the medieval Islamic Caliphate conquests and the application of the law.
Yeah. Well, in about the minute that we have left then, so what you're seeing is there seems to be a parsing out, kind of a separating of one kind of Islam with another, and you're saying actually there's only one Islam and it is tied in with Sharia law and it must be considered that way, correct?
Yes, that doesn't mean that some practitioners of Islam may not follow to the letter what the law in medieval times said, and perhaps some interpreters today of that law may argue that in medieval times those experts in the law were wrong and they didn't know how to interpret the law correctly. That's a different issue. But we have even a presidential candidate like Carly Fiorina saying that the Islamic Caliphate in medieval times was very tolerant. She has no idea what she's talking about. And that is very representative. If we have presidential candidates who are saying these things, what can we expect from the public?
No, that's true. And so how long ago was your book published?
It just came out February 22nd.
Okay. And I think this will be a fascinating thing for people who want to know more about what's going on with Islam from a historical standpoint, because I think a lot of times we don't really look at it that way and we try to create it into something that it perhaps isn't. But when you look at the history, I think that helps to put things in perspective. The myth of the Andalusian Paradise, Muslims, Christians, and Jews under Islamic rule in medieval Spain is the name of the book. Any parting thoughts that you have about what we should, as we're watching the news, what we should consider? We've got about 30 seconds. What would you suggest that we should do through this magnifying glass?
We should get as much data as we can get about the, for example, the refugees that we want to accept here. We need to know what are their views on our laws and the Constitution. Do they favor our laws and our Constitution over Islamic law? Do we have police records of all these people? So decisions have to be based on what a researcher needs, which is data. We need data to make decisions.
All right. Thank you very much. Dr. Darío Fernández-Morera, Associate Professor at the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Northwest University, with his book. You may want to look it up, again, The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us for Focus Today.